You're broke on Nexus Station 9, counting credits like they're oxygen. Then you buy lunch for a mantis alien who calls himself a cultural analyst, and he hands you what looks like a worthless trinket. 3 days later, an appraiser tells you it's worth 12 million credits. This is how one meal rewrote 2 lives. You know what it's like when 20 credits is your entire life savings. You don't just count them. You feel them like individual breaths at high altitude, each one rationed against the next expense. Survival on Nexus Station 9 means tracking every calorie, measuring every cubic foot of oxygen, calculating each credit against a spreadsheet of basic needs. The station charges for air, for gravity, for the privilege of not floating off into the void. Corporate employees get it all comped, of course, but independents like you pay retail, which is just a polite word for extortion. The universe seems to specialize in these quiet, personal apocalypses. One miscalculation, one delayed payment, and suddenly you're watching your atmosphere gauge tick down while trying to negotiate an extension with an automated collections AI. Your salvage rig, the rust bucket, doesn't earn enough to cover its own docking fees most cycles. It's older than you are, smells like burned wiring and regret, and its diagnostic screen has more red warnings than a core breach drill. You start recognizing that hollow stare in other spacers' eyes, the ones who've stopped checking their accounts because they already know the numbers won't change. Deep space stations show the widest wealth gaps in known space, which is saying something when entire planets survive on corporate welfare. The rust bucket's maintenance debt grows faster than you can work it off, trapping you in a cycle where every credit earned immediately belongs to someone else. Every decision carries weight here. Choosing real food over nutrient paste could mean missing a pressure seal repair. Taking a risky salvage job might cover fees but could also leave you stranded if the rig fails. You develop a constant, low-grade awareness of every system, every resource, every potential disaster waiting in the shadows of the station's lower decks. This constant pressure turns ordinary choices into survival calculus. A simple meal isn't just nutrition, it's a calculation against oxygen costs, lost work time, and the dwindling number of credits between you and vacuum. Which makes what happened with Crixavy either the worst mistake of your life or the only thing that could possibly change it. Look, I'm going to level with you about first contact situations. Most of them don't happen in controlled environments with diplomatic protocols. They happen in docking bays, maintenance corridors, and, in this case, outside a food vendor selling questionable protein paste. Crixavy wasn't begging. He was negotiating with the bored Threxian server for a smaller portion at reduced cost. His mantis-like limbs gesturing with a kind of desperate formality. His carapace had that jade-green sheen that usually signals danger in 3 different xenobiology textbooks, but his translator badge kept flashing xenosociologist in standard glyphs. You know how most species react to Cathvolians. Their homeworld's economic collapse created the largest refugee diaspora in the sector, and desperation makes people nervous. Station security bulletins literally recommend maintaining distance and reporting any unusual behavioral patterns. So when he turned those multifaceted eyes toward you instead of the vendor, every instinct said to back away slowly. But his translator spoke with academic precision, explaining his research into interspecies communication protocols while his thoracic plates clicked in what you'd later learn was anxiety, not aggression. Cultural analysts usually work for megacorps or government agencies, not starving on backwater stations. They get expense accounts, research grants, proper housing. Crixavy had a data pad held together with binder tape and the kind of posture that suggested he'd been sleeping in zero-G storage lockers. When he offered you half his reduced portion nutrient paste, he did it like a scholar presenting a rare cultural artifact, all deliberate movement and solemn courtesy. The paste tasted like recycled proteins and regret, but the gesture felt oddly dignified. His insistence on repayment felt like another survival strategy. Nothing's free out here, and cultural rituals sometimes mask practical needs. You'd been offered gifts before that turned out to be obligations, trades, or outright scams. The station security manual has whole chapters on why you shouldn't share meals with unfamiliar species, cross-contamination risks, cultural misunderstandings, potential dependency issues. But sometimes the rules don't account for basic decency. That shared paste became a bridge, not some grand diplomatic achievement, just 2 beings recognizing mutual hardship across a species divide. You bought him a full meal instead, which felt both generous and stupid considering your credit balance. He accepted with that same formal gratitude, his antennae twitching in what might have been amusement or hunger. The whole exchange took maybe 10 minutes, the kind of small interaction that normally gets forgotten in the daily grind of survival. But here's the thing about alien gratitude. It doesn't always look like what you expect. Crix V's people have concepts of debt that make human loan agreements look simple. That meal wasn't just calories traded. It became a cultural transaction with obligations you couldn't possibly understand yet. The foundation for everything that followed got laid right there, between bites of synthesized protein and the hum of failing station systems. You know how some gifts feel more like obligations? They carry weight beyond their physical form, creating debts you never agreed to owe. Crix V pressed that smooth disc into your palm with a formality that felt ancient, his mantis-like fingers lingering just a moment too long. He called it a family heirloom from Cathvol, his thoracic plates making that soft clicking sound that might have been reverence or just nervous energy. The transaction felt less like generosity and more like ritual, one of those cross-cultural exchanges that usually ends with someone accidentally insulting someone's ancestors. The disc itself seemed utterly unremarkable at first glance. It shifted colors in different light, blue under the station's harsh fluorescence, green near the viewports, almost translucent in shadow. Like mood jewelry from some cheap vendor in the lower markets, the kind tourists buy before realizing they've overpaid for dyed plastic. You'd seen enough alien artifacts to know most turn out to be worthless souvenirs or dangerous contraband. Last month, someone tried to pawn a ceremonial vase that turned out to contain dormant spores that nearly breached quarantine protocols. His insistence felt scripted, like he was following some cultural playbook for debt repayment, rather than expressing genuine gratitude. Most refugees from collapsing worlds pawn their heirlooms long before reaching Nexus 9. Sentimentality doesn't pay docking fees or buy oxygen. The fact he still had this thing suggested either profound cultural significance or that nobody would take it in trade. You accepted mostly to end the awkward exchange, already mentally calculating which pawnshop might give you a few credits for it. The weight felt wrong in your hand, too light for metal, too heavy for plastic or ceramic. It had that peculiar density that makes your brain question basic material science. You slipped it into your pocket with a nod, the way you'd accept a business card from someone you never intended to contact again. The whole interaction lasted maybe 30 seconds, barely registering against the background noise of station life. The hum of environmental systems, the distant clang of docking operations, the constant murmur of species negotiating their daily survival. Another odd moment in a place full of them, filed away under strange but ultimately unimportant. That trivial gesture would eventually force you to reconsider every assumption about value, debt, and cross-cultural communication. The universe specializes in these little jokes, taking the smallest, most thoughtless moments and loading them with consequences that ripple across light years. What felt like ending an awkward interaction became the start of something neither of you could have predicted, all because one culture's trivial tradition turned out to be another's unimaginable wealth. Let me back up to explain how station appraisals work. When you're broke on Nexus 9, you don't go to the fancy licensed dealers near the corporate sectors. You go to places like Garrett's shop in the lower market ring, where the lighting is bad enough to hide imperfections and the security cameras conveniently malfunction during certain transactions. Garrett specialized in questionable items, the kind of stuff that might be stolen, illegal, or just morally ambiguous. His shop smelled like ozone and dishonesty, with a counter scarred by countless exchanged goods and hasty negotiations. You placed the disc on his counter with that familiar feeling of mild shame, already preparing to argue for at least 5 credits instead of 3. Garrett picked up his handheld scanner with the usual disinterest, the device humming as it passed over the surface. Then his entire demeanor changed. The scanner clattered onto the counter, rolling against a stack of data chips. He actually stepped back from the counter, his eyes widening behind his magnifying lenses. Appraisers like Garrett see everything. Stolen corporate tech, illegal bioweapons, artifacts from protected worlds, they process it all with professional detachment. Their entire business model depends on not reacting, on maintaining that bored expression while calculating profit margins. But Garrett's hand started shaking as he picked up the scanner again, running a second pass over the disc. His voice dropped to a whisper when he said the word valorium, like speaking it too loud might attract unwanted attention. You'd heard the term before in Spacer Stories, the kind of legendary material that supposedly powered ancient starships or stabilized wormholes, the rarest stable element in known space, with properties that made physicists question fundamental laws. Garrett's valuation, 12 million credits, wasn't just life-changing money. It exceeded the annual GDP of some colony worlds. The Rust Bucket's entire maintenance debt could be paid off 16,000 times over. Most salvagers spend their lives dreaming of one decent score, maybe enough to upgrade their rig or buy a small asteroid claim. This was beyond fantasy territory. This was the kind of wealth that came with its own security details and assassination risks. The insurance premium alone would bankrupt entire station sectors. Garrett kept checking his instruments like they'd malfunctioned, muttering about atomic-level stability and energy conduction rates that shouldn't be possible. Suddenly, the shared meal with Crixv looked less like charity and more like the most spectacular investment strategy in galactic history. The cultural analyst had handed over what might be the single most valuable portable object on the station, without any apparent awareness of its worth. Meanwhile, Crixv was probably still somewhere in the lower decks, studying translation algorithms or trying to negotiate for another reduced portion of nutrient paste, completely unaware that he'd just given away a fortune that could buy entire food distribution networks. The disconnect between his perception and reality was about to become the central problem of both your lives. Here's the thing about tracking. Someone on Nexus Station 9. The station's population floats somewhere around 80,000 transient beings on any given cycle, with species from 17 different systems moving through its docking rings. Finding one specific alien in that swirling mass of desperation and bureaucracy makes finding a specific molecule in a gas cloud look simple. The station's official records listed Crixv as a cultural analyst with no fixed address, which is station administration code for we have no idea where this person sleeps and we don't want to know. The designation. Might as well have read Professional Ghost. Your network search pulled up 43 registered Cathfolians, all listed with that same transient status, all equally desperate and moving through the station's ecosystem like particles in Brownian motion. Most refugees avoid proper registration because it creates paper trails, and paper trails lead to deportation hearings or corporate recruitment offers. The station's bureaucratic systems weren't designed to find people. They were engineered to lose them efficiently, to maintain plausible deniability when corporations asked uncomfortable questions about workforce origins. Your only real clue was his research specialty. Interspecies communication protocols aren't exactly a popular field of study among station transients. Most beings trying to survive day to day don't care about linguistic nuance or cultural translation matrices. They care about calories and oxygen and avoiding security patrols. So you started checking public terminal bays and data libraries, places where someone might access academic networks without paying subscription fees. The station's data infrastructure worked against you at every turn. Public terminals automatically wiped user histories every 6 hours. Library access required biometric identification that most transients actively avoided. You spent 2 days following false leads, a Cathvolian studying hydroponics in Sector 7, another working waste reclamation, a third who turned out to be a completely different species who'd stolen a dead researcher's identification chip. Each dead end made that Valorium disk feel heavier in your pocket, its value becoming less about credits and more about the ethical weight of what you'd received. You finally realized the search required understanding what brought him to Nexus 9 in the first place. Not just the surface-level refugee from economic collapse story, but the specific cultural drivers that would make a xenosociologist choose this particular crumbling station over dozens of others. The answer wasn't in station records or terminal logs. It was in understanding why someone would cling to academic pursuits while starving. Why communication theory might matter more than basic survival. The breakthrough came when you stopped looking for a person and started looking for patterns. Cultural analysts follow specific research methodologies, access particular data networks, leave certain digital fingerprints in academic systems. You found his access patterns in the anthropological databases, his query history about human communication rituals, his notes on interspecies gift-giving traditions. The trail led to Terminal Bay Gamma 12, where he'd been studying translation algorithms for 16 hours straight, surviving on stolen power and whatever nutrient packets he could trade for. Look, I'm going to level with you about rare elements. Most of what spacers call rare is just moderately difficult to mine or synthesize. Valorium operates on a completely different scale. It's practically mythological among material scientists, the kind of thing that appears in theoretical papers and ancient ship logs, but rarely makes it into actual laboratories. Its stability at atomic level 7 makes it impossible to synthesize using known methods, and nobody's ever managed to destroy a sample either. The stuff just sits there, defying conventional physics while maintaining perfect structural integrity across temperature ranges that would vaporize neutron stars, the galactic materials. Consortium had only certified 3 specimens in the past century, and each certification required 12 peer reviews, 7 independent verifications, and enough paperwork to physically fill a small cargo bay. Its energy conduction properties make it worth more than antimatter per gram. Because unlike antimatter, it doesn't require containment fields or risk annihilating your laboratory if someone sneezes near the storage unit. Valorium can channel energy without loss, without heat generation, without any of the usual inefficiencies that make power systems so complicated. A circuit built with Valorium components would never need cooling, never suffer resistance decay, never require maintenance beyond basic cleaning. Most governments classify Valorium research to prevent economic destabilization. The entire energy sector would collapse overnight if someone developed practical applications. Mining corporations would become obsolete, power distribution networks would need complete redesigns, and the balance of galactic power would shift toward whoever controlled the supply. That's why Garrett's shop suddenly developed new security protocols and why his hands shook when handling your disk. His initial appraisal of 12 million credits might have been conservative. Black market buyers would easily pay double, no questions asked, with payment in untraceable crypto or precious metals. The craftsmanship on your particular specimen added another layer of complication. The disk showed signs of pre-spaceflight technology, with tool marks suggesting handcrafting rather than industrial replication. That shouldn't be possible. Valorium's stability makes it nearly impossible to work without specialized equipment that didn't exist before interstellar travel. The patterns etched into its surface matched Cathvolian artistic traditions from their planetary unification era, centuries before they developed spaceflight capability. Either their ancestors had technology we don't understand, or they found ways to shape Valorium that modern science has yet to discover. This wasn't just wealth, it was historical significance made tangible. The disk represented not only material value, but cultural knowledge, technological secrets, and questions that could rewrite chapters of xenoarchaeology textbooks. Garrett kept muttering about museum acquisitions and research grants, his usual cynical demeanor replaced by something approaching academic excitement. The weight in your pocket suddenly felt less like currency and more like responsibility, the kind that comes with owning something that belongs to multiple disciplines and potentially entire civilizations. But here's the thing about cultural artifacts. They carry context that market valuations can't possibly capture. That disk wasn't just a rare element. It was somebody's family history, a culture's technological heritage, a puzzle that might explain how a species went from shaping Valorium by hand to becoming economic refugees on a crumbling space station. The material value almost became secondary to the historical implications, the cultural weight, the unanswered questions about how something this valuable became so misunderstood by its own creators. You know how some conversations change your entire reality? They start like any other exchange. A greeting, some context, the usual social noises, and then someone says something that rewires your understanding of how the universe operates. Finding Crixvy in Terminal Bay Gamma 12 felt exactly like that. He was hunched over a public terminal, his mantis-like limbs moving with that precise academic focus you remembered, completely absorbed in translation algorithms. The screen showed complex linguistic matrices while his personal belongings sat in a neat pile beside him. Data pads, a nutrient pouch, the kind of minimal existence that spoke volumes about his circumstances. You placed the Valorium disk on the terminal beside him. His compound eyes tracked from the screen to the object, then to your face. His translator produced a polite query tone, the kind used for academic clarification. His reaction contained exactly 0% excitement or recognition. Pure confusion layered with that particular Cavolian head tilt that means I require additional data. He called it just a traditional thing every family possesses back home. His translator, rendering the phrase with casual indifference. The disk represented cultural continuity. not material value, a token passed down through generations with stories about ancestors and traditions. His great-grandmother's stories treated these objects as folklore artifacts, not financial assets. She spoke of craftsmanship traditions, cultural rituals, the kind of historical trivia that gets preserved while practical knowledge gets lost. Most Cathvolian families had similar heirlooms, all presumed worthless after their economy collapsed. When survival becomes the priority, cultural artifacts become weight, both physical and psychological. They get stored away, forgotten, sometimes discarded when refugees need to lighten their loads. The entire species developed collective blindness toward their own historical wealth, their desperation creating a cultural filter that rendered priceless artifacts insignificant. The realization that he'd given away a fortune didn't trigger excitement or greed. It made his thoracic plates contract in what you'd learn was cultural shame. His species has strict protocols about gift-giving and reciprocity, complicated rules about appropriate exchange values and cultural respect. Giving something of enormous value without understanding its worth violated multiple social codes. His antennae drooped, his limbs drew inward, his entire posture shifted from academic engagement to defensive withdrawal. The knowledge didn't empower him, it burdened him with layers of cultural embarrassment and social failure. His people's economic collapse had blinded them to their own historical treasures. When your entire civilization focuses on basic survival, when every decision revolves around obtaining food and oxygen and avoiding deportation, you stop seeing cultural artifacts as anything but weight. The Valorium tokens became just another thing to carry, another piece of ancestral baggage that didn't help with immediate problems. Their true value got lost in the desperate scramble for survival, buried under more pressing concerns like avoiding starvation and finding safe shelter. The ethical dilemma suddenly shifted from personal gain to cultural preservation. This wasn't about whether you got to keep 12 million credits. It was about whether an entire civilization's heritage had been accidentally liquidated for short-term survival. The disc represented not just material wealth but historical knowledge, cultural identity, technological secrets that might explain how Cathvol fell from Valorium-shaping masters to economic refugees. Your windfall became someone else's cultural tragedy, the kind of historical loss that gets studied by future xenoarchaeologists with mounting horror. It turns out poverty makes you blind to your own treasures. When you're counting credits like oxygen, when every decision carries survival implications, you stop seeing value in anything that doesn't immediately address your basic needs. Cultural heritage becomes luxury, historical knowledge becomes irrelevant, and family heirlooms become just more weight in your pack. The Cathvolians' economic collapse didn't just impoverish them materially, it impoverished their cultural memory, their historical awareness, their ability to recognize what they actually possessed. Let me back up to explain interspecies ethics. They don't follow logical progressions or standardized rules. They operate like competing operating systems that weren't designed to interface. Proposing a 50-50 split felt simultaneously generous and completely inadequate, like offering someone half their own stolen property. The numbers worked on paper. 6 million credits each could solve every practical problem either of you had. But the ethical calculations kept generating error messages. Keeping the entire fortune would technically qualify as theft under several interstellar legal frameworks. But returning it felt equally wrong because it ignored the cultural context of the original transaction. The gift had been freely given, just under completely false assumptions about its value. Crix V operated under his species' cultural protocols while you operated under station survivor rules. Most galactic courts would award the finder everything under salvage rights legislation. Finders keepers is practically enshrined in interstellar law when no fraud or force is involved. The legal precedents stretched back centuries, all favoring the party who recognized value where others saw worthless objects. You could have walked away wealthy and legally clean, with documentation to prove it. Crix V's cultural framework demanded he refuse any share. His people have strict rules about gifted items. Once given, they cannot be taken back or have conditions attached without violating multiple honor codes. His thoracic plates actually vibrated in distress at the suggestion of accepting payment for something already freely offered. The concept of splitting value made as much sense to him as dividing oxygen molecules. It violated fundamental principles of transaction integrity. His translator kept producing phrases like, cultural contamination, and reciprocal obligation imbalance while he physically backed away from the negotiation. Human practicality clashed with Cavolian honor in spectacular fashion. You kept citing logical arguments about fair distribution, while he cited ancestral traditions about gift purity. The discussion became less about money and more about whether two completely different ethical systems could even communicate basic concepts to each other. Garrett's astonishment when you explained the situation revealed how alien human ethics appear to outsiders. He kept shaking his head, muttering about how only humans would try to give away fortunes they'd legally acquired. His profit-driven perspective couldn't process why you wouldn't just take the money and disappear. The compromise emerged from recognizing that neither framework could accommodate the situation. You couldn't keep it without ethical discomfort. He couldn't take it without cultural violation. The solution involved creating a completely new structure that served both your needs without violating either ethical system. The Valorium wouldn't be returned or split. It would become capital for something that addressed both the immediate practical needs and the cultural obligations. The disk would fund an initiative that honored its origins while creating new value beyond mere credits. Meanwhile, the real value was about to reveal itself in ways neither of you anticipated. The initial appraisal had focused solely on material worth, completely missing the historical and cultural significance that would soon become apparent. The compromise you were negotiating would eventually seem trivial compared to what specialists would discover about the artifact's true importance. Your ethical dilemma was about to expand from personal gain versus cultural respect to something involving entire civilizations and their misunderstood histories. Here's the thing about the Galactic Materials Consortium. They don't send junior analysts for something like this. Director Walsh arrived with the kind of security detail usually reserved for planetary governors. Her credentials granting immediate access to sectors most residents never even see. She represented the single largest buyer of rare materials in known space, the kind of institutional power that makes corporate executives nervous. Her preliminary scan of the Valorium disk took approximately 3 seconds before she made her opening offer. 12.7 million credits, delivered however you wanted, no questions asked about provenance. That number already felt astronomical. It represented more wealth than entire station sectors generated in a standard cycle. You could have bought luxury orbitals, private shuttle fleets, enough influence to reshape local politics. But then her instrumentation picked up something Garrett's shop equipment had missed. The subtle tool marks, the specific patterning, the molecular alignment that indicated handcrafting rather than machine fabrication. Her professional detachment evaporated the moment she identified it as pre-integration, Caithvol artisan work. The provenance added historical value that completely dwarfed the material worth. Most Valorium specimens exist as raw elements or industrial components, curiosities for laboratory study or power system enhancement. This was the first authenticated piece from before the Caithvol economic collapse, a cultural artifact that happened to be made from the rarest stable element in existence. The craftsmanship suggested techniques modern science couldn't replicate, knowledge lost when their civilization fragmented. Director Walsh's instruments kept registering values that made her security team adjust their positions, like they were guarding something suddenly more dangerous than valuable. Her final offer, 18.3 million total, reflected both material and cultural significance. The consortium didn't just want the Valorium. They wanted the historical data, the craftsmanship secrets, the unanswered questions about how a pre-spaceflight civilization could work such impossible material. The disk became a key to understanding an entire civilization's collapse, a physical clue to how a species capable of shaping Valorium devolved into economic refugees scattered across space stations. The additional 5.6 million credits represented investment in research potential, in historical preservation, in acquiring something truly unique rather than merely rare. The transaction paperwork included non-disclosure agreements that would make a spy nervous, cultural preservation clauses, and research-sharing protocols that gave Krixevi's people partial ownership of any discoveries. Director Walsh handled the negotiations with the efficiency of someone who routinely purchased small moons, her team processing documentation faster than most stations handled docking clearances. The whole operation took less than an hour, transforming what began as a desperate meal-sharing gesture into an institutional acquisition that would fund research for decades. Which brings us to what happens after you become spectacularly rich. The numbers stop meaning anything around the 8 million credit mark. They become abstract figures on screens, calculations that exceed normal human scale. You stop thinking about personal expenses and start confronting logistical questions about security, investment, and the kind of responsibility that comes with resources that could destabilize local economies. The rust bucket's maintenance debt becomes a rounding error. Station docking fees become trivialities, and your entire relationship with basic survival undergoes fundamental rewiring. Look, I'm going to level with you about sudden wealth. When those credit transfers hit your accounts, 9.15 million each, the numbers stopped meaning anything around the second comma. You know how normal financial planning involves budgeting for oxygen and repairs? This was like trying to drink from a fire hose while calculating hydrodynamics in real time. The human brain isn't wired to process resources at that scale. Crixvy's reaction was even more extreme. His species never developed large number economics because their civilization collapsed before reaching that stage of development. The concept of individual ownership of planetary scale wealth literally didn't translate. Personal luxury felt obscene when his homeworld was still collapsing. You'd look at brochures for luxury orbitals or custom spacecraft, then remember Cathvol's refugee statistics, the ongoing economic migration, the corporate exploitation, the generations of systemic poverty that made your former struggles on Nexus 9 look like minor inconveniences. The economic forces that drove him to that food vendor continued operating across his entire civilization. Their infrastructure kept failing. Their resources kept being extracted by off-world corporations. Their cultural knowledge kept eroding with each generation born in exile. Most lottery winners end up bankrupt within 5 years. Galactic statistics are actually worse when you account for currency, fluctuations, and predatory financial advisors. Sudden wealth attracts complications like decompression holes attract emergency seals. You'd need security teams, financial managers, legal protection, and that's before considering the cross-species taxation nightmares. Human nature would suggest buying ships and stations, building personal empires, establishing dynastic wealth. The temptation to never worry about oxygen costs again was powerful. You could literally buy your own atmosphere processors. Cathvolian culture would dictate returning everything to the homeworld. Their collective ethos treats individual windfalls as communal resources, especially when the species faces existential threats. Crixvy's initial impulse was to transfer his entire share to planetary relief funds, which would have been like trying to stop a supernova with a handheld extinguisher. The money would have disappeared into bureaucratic systems without changing anything fundamental. The compromise emerged from recognizing what neither could do alone. Your practical understanding of station economics combined with his cultural knowledge created something neither perspective could achieve separately. Instead of personal spending or blind donations, the money became a tool for systemic change. You established escrow accounts with performance-based release protocols, created oversight committees with species representation, implemented verification systems to prevent corporate diversion. The funds targeted infrastructure rather than temporary aid, atmosphere processors instead of oxygen tanks, agricultural domes instead of food shipments, education systems instead of temporary visas. The money became leverage rather than consumption, a way to change economic equations rather than just temporarily balance them. You bought debt relief for entire refugee communities, negotiated directly with corporations that exploited Cathvolian labor, funded research into restoring their planetary environment. But here's the thing about fixing broken systems. The money didn't solve anything by itself. It just created opportunities for solutions to emerge. The real work involved navigating bureaucratic resistance, cultural misunderstandings, and the simple inertia of systems designed to maintain the status quo. The windfall became less about personal comfort and more about strategic intervention, less about individual security, and more about creating stability where none existed. The scale of the problems made the money feel small again, just in different ways than before. You know how some ideas seem obvious in hindsight? Like, why didn't anyone think of putting wheels on luggage or adding timestamps to messages? The Crixvy Foundation for Interspecies Understanding addressed one of those glaring gaps everyone had learned to work around. Galactic diplomacy operated on flawed translation algorithms and cultural assumptions that hadn't been updated since first contact protocols were established. The Foundation's first goal wasn't grand mediation between empires. It was creating neutral ground where species could actually understand each other without layers of faulty interpretation. Most interspecies conflicts arise from mistranslated intentions rather than actual malice. A trade disagreement becomes a diplomatic incident because someone's word for negotiation translates as subjugation in another language. A cultural gesture of respect gets interpreted as aggression due to posture or eye contact differences. The galaxy had accepted this constant friction as normal, the way people accept bad weather or unstable wormholes as inevitable conditions, rather than solvable problems. Your role as Director of Practical Affairs meant mediating real-world misunderstandings before they escalated, like when a human merchant kept offending Aquatic Republic delegates by standing too close during negotiations. Their species interprets proximity as territorial challenge. Or when Xerion traders nearly walked away from a deal because the translation software rendered flexible terms as unstable. Agreements. These weren't policy-level issues requiring diplomatic summits. They were basic communication, failures that cost millions in lost trade and damaged relations. Crixvy's academic approach needed your salvage worker practicality to function. He could write brilliant papers on intercultural communication theory, but struggled with actual implementation. You understood how things worked in practice, the shortcuts, the workarounds, the reality of dealing with tired officials and malfunctioning translation devices. His research provided the framework, but your field experience made it applicable to actual interspecies interactions. The combination proved unexpectedly powerful, like having both the technical manual and the tools to make the repairs. The Foundation became what neither species could create separately. Human organizations tended toward aggressive expansion or profit-driven solutions. Cathvolian approaches emphasize theoretical perfection over practical application. Together, you developed protocols that actually worked in the messy reality of cross-species interaction. You created standardized translation checklists, cultural briefing packages for traders, even simple gesture guides that prevented accidental insults during negotiations. The solutions weren't elegant or academically pure. They were functional, which made them valuable. It turns out that practical empathy is the rarest commodity in space. The ability to not just understand another species' perspective, but to actually apply that understanding in real-time interactions, that's what prevented conflicts and opened trade routes. The Foundation's work demonstrated that most interspecies problems weren't about incompatible goals or irreconcilable differences. They were about poor communication, cultural missteps, and the accumulated friction of small misunderstandings that never got properly addressed. The Valorium money had created the opportunity, but the real value emerged from combining two completely different ways of seeing the universe. Let me back up to explain why neutral territory matters. Most diplomatic stations orbit homeworlds or cluster near political centers, which means they inherently favor one species' environmental needs and cultural frameworks. The temperature, atmosphere, gravity, all optimized for the host species, making everyone else uncomfortable in ways that subtly influence negotiations. Harmony Station changed that fundamental dynamic by existing in truly neutral space, its location requiring unprecedented cooperation just to establish jurisdiction. 7 different governments had to agree on access rights, security protocols, and administrative oversight, which created more paperwork than the station's actual construction. The station's design incorporated multiple environmental systems that could be customized per section. Negotiation chambers could shift atmospheric composition between meetings. Gravity plates could adjust to different species' preferences. Even lighting systems could cycle through various spectral ranges. Most diplomatic stations make token accommodations, a separate room with different air mix, maybe some adjustable seating. Harmony built flexibility into its core architecture, creating spaces that could genuinely accommodate anyone without making anyone feel like a secondary consideration. Your salvage experience proved unexpectedly valuable during the design phase. You understood how systems actually fail in practice, how maintenance crews work around design flaws, how users adapt or don't adapt to impractical layouts. When engineers proposed complex environmental zones that required 6-hour recalibration between uses, you suggested simpler sectional divisions with overlapping conditioning. When cultural consultants wanted perfectly authentic zones for each species, You pointed out that most beings can tolerate minor variations if the core needs get met. Practical field knowledge often trumped theoretical perfection. Crick SV's cultural knowledge prevented hundreds of unintentional insults during the station's operational testing. He caught spatial arrangements that would make Aquatic Republic delegates feel trapped, color schemes that signaled aggression to Zerion perceptions, even furniture shapes that carried unfortunate connotations in 3 different cultures. His attention to these details transformed the station from merely functional to genuinely welcoming across species lines. The difference was subtle but critical, like the distinction between tolerating a space and actually feeling comfortable in it. The first successful mediation, a trade dispute between Zerions and Aquatic Republics, proved the concept beyond any theoretical arguments. Both species had walked away from previous negotiation attempts on their respective homeworlds, citing environmental discomfort and subtle cultural pressures. On harmony, they reached agreement in 2 sessions, with delegates from both sides commenting on how the neutral environment reduced defensive posturing. The station didn't just host the talks, it actively facilitated them through design choices that put everyone on equal footing. The station became living proof that cooperation could outperform conflict. Its very existence demonstrated that multiple species could create something together that none could achieve alone. The environmental systems, the architectural compromises, the shared administrative structures, all represented practical solutions to problems that had previously seemed insurmountable. Diplomats started requesting harmony for sensitive negotiations specifically because its environment reduced the inherent advantages that home territory provided. Meanwhile, the real work was happening in translation algorithms. The station's physical environment provided the stage, but accurate communication remained the actual performance. While architects celebrated successful mediation events, linguists and programmers were wrestling with the far more complex problem of making sure everyone actually understood what everyone else meant. The fancy environmental controls mattered little if a mistranslated pronoun could still derail entire negotiations. Here's the thing about universal translators. They handle basic vocabulary well enough, nouns, verbs, the obvious stuff. But nuance, cultural context, emotional subtext, they might as well be guessing. The systems work fine for ordering food or asking directions, but put them in a tense diplomatic situation, and they start generating misunderstandings like defective replicators produce toxic waste. The problem isn't the technology, it's the assumption that language operates like code that can be neatly converted between systems without losing meaning along the way. They're notoriously bad at conveying nuance, especially when tensions run high. Stress changes speech patterns, cultural references get mangled, and pronouns become linguistic minefields. The Aquatic Republics and Zerion Collective had been negotiating trade access for 3 cycles, with relations deteriorating each session. Delegates from both sides kept reporting that the other party seemed increasingly hostile and unreasonable. The translators indicated everyone was speaking the same language, but the conversations felt like they were happening through increasingly distorted filters. A mistranslated pronoun almost triggered a decades-long conflict. The Zerion Collective uses a singular you that carries neutral formality in their language. Their translation software rendered it correctly into standard Galactic, but the aquatic languages interpreted that specific pronoun as accusatory and confrontational. Every time a Zerion delegate said you in reference to proposed terms, the aquatic delegation heard what translated roughly as you specifically are at fault here. The negotiations weren't just stalled, they were actively creating new grievances with each session. The Zerion collectives, you translated as accusatory in aquatic languages, turning constructive suggestions into personal attacks. What should have been, we believe these terms benefit both parties, became, we accuse you of undermining these discussions. The aquatic delegates grew increasingly defensive, their own language shifting to more formal and distant patterns that the Zerion translators interpreted as cold rejection. The feedback loop of mistranslation created artificial hostility, where none actually existed, pushing both sides toward formal protests and potential sanctions. Most diplomats would have escalated through formal protests and sanctions. Standard procedure involved filing grievances, imposing trade restrictions, and gradually ratcheting up pressure until someone conceded or walked away. The cycle had repeated across dozens of conflicts, with neither side understanding why communications kept breaking down. The assumption was always that the other party was negotiating in bad faith or harboring hidden hostilities, never that the translation systems themselves were generating the misunderstanding. Your team caught the error in real time during the fourth negotiation session. Crixv noticed the pronoun discrepancy while monitoring the linguistic patterns, cross-referencing the original Xerian with the aquatic interpretation. The realization hit during a tense exchange about resource allocation. The moment when your proposed allocation seems inadequate became your personal contribution appears deficient in translation. The team flagged the issue to both delegations, providing immediate clarification before positions could harden further. The solution involved creating entirely new translation protocols for diplomatic use. Standard systems worked well enough for commerce and basic interaction, but high-stakes negotiations required specialized algorithms that could flag potential misinterpretations in real time. The protocols didn't just translate words, they analyzed context, tracked emotional tone, and provided cultural annotations that explained why certain phrases might carry unintended meanings. The systems became negotiation assistants rather than simple translation tools. Crixv's research became the basis for the first accurate interspecies communication standards. His work on linguistic nuance and cultural context, previously considered academic trivia, provided the theoretical foundation for practical implementation. The standards addressed everything from pronoun usage to gesture interpretation, creating a framework that could adapt to different negotiation contexts and cultural backgrounds. What began as theoretical research suddenly became essential infrastructure for preventing galactic conflicts. Preventing that conflict justified the Foundation's entire budget for a decade. The near disaster demonstrated that mistranslation wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an existential risk to interstellar relations. The resources invested in developing better communication systems suddenly seemed way buzu dao, compared to the costs of even minor diplomatic breakdowns. The incident transformed how the galaxy approached interspecies communication, shifting from treating it as a solved problem to recognizing it as an ongoing challenge requiring constant attention and refinement. Which brings us to why common sense is rarer than valorium. Look, I'm going to level with you about systemic change. It doesn't arrive with dramatic announcements or decisive battles. It accumulates through thousands of small adjustments, like atmosphere leaking into a compromised hull until the pressure finally equalizes. The Foundation's impact extended far beyond those initial mediation successes, seeping into economic systems, educational networks, and cultural exchanges that hadn't functioned properly in generations. What began as conflict prevention gradually became system optimization, fixing communication flaws that everyone had accepted as inevitable conditions of interstellar relations. Economic partnerships formed where previously only suspicion existed. Trade routes reopened between species that hadn't exchanged more than formal protests in decades. The Xerian Aquatic Agreement became a template for similar arrangements elsewhere, demonstrating that reliable communication could transform potential conflicts into profitable collaborations. Shipping lanes that had been abandoned due to diplomatic tensions suddenly became viable again, creating new markets and supply chains that bypassed traditional corporate monopolies. The economic ripple effects started showing up in commodity prices, employment rates, and infrastructure development across multiple systems. Educational exchanges reduced xenophobia better than any political initiative ever could. Students from previously isolated cultures started studying together on Harmony Station, sharing not just academic knowledge, but practical experiences of coexisting. The Foundation funded translation systems for universities, created cross-cultural internship programs, even developed standardized testing that accounted for different cognitive frameworks. The exchanges weren't just academic, they created personal connections that eventually influenced policy decisions, trade negotiations, and cultural understanding at levels formal diplomacy could never reach. Most galactic organizations measure success in conflicts avoided rather than wars fought. The metrics become negative space, the absence of incidents, the reduction in formal protests, the diplomatic crises that never materialized. The Foundation's reports filled with statistics about arbitration cases resolved, trade disputes settled, cultural misunderstandings clarified before they escalated. The work lacked dramatic footage or heroic moments, just page after page of problems that didn't happen because someone caught a mistranslation or explained a cultural nuance at the right time. The paperwork became its own kind of diplomacy, boring but effective. Grant applications, compliance reports, intergovernmental agreements, all the bureaucratic machinery that makes actual cooperation possible. Your salvage background helped cut through the nonsense that stalled academics and career diplomats. You knew how to simplify complex procedures, eliminate redundant steps, and focus on practical outcomes rather than theoretical perfection. That field experience proved more valuable than any diplomatic training when dealing with the galaxy's Byzantine administrative systems. The initial act of kindness created stability across entire sectors. That single meal with Crix V eventually influenced economic policies, educational standards, and diplomatic protocols light years from Nexus Station 9. The Valorium money had been the catalyst, but the real transformation came from applying practical problem-solving to systemic issues that everyone else treated as immutable realities. The Foundation didn't just resolve conflicts, it demonstrated that many problems weren't fundamental incompatibilities but communication, failures that could be systematically addressed. But here's the thing about measuring impact. The most significant changes often appear in metrics nobody thinks to track. The trade agreements that don't collapse, the cultural exchanges that don't generate complaints, the diplomatic communications that don't require clarification. The real success stories were the conflicts that never happened, the misunderstandings that got caught early, the cultural offenses that were prevented through better preparation. The work became increasingly invisible as it became more effective, which made explaining its value increasingly complicated. You know how some truths become obvious only after someone says them? They hang there in plain sight for centuries, waiting for someone to connect the dots everyone else overlooked. Crix V's observation about common sense resonated because it explained so much about why the galaxy functioned the way it did. The Foundation adopted it as a guiding principle not because it was revolutionary, but because it named something everyone had experienced but never properly identified. The galaxy contains technology that bends physics, medicine that extends lifespans, engineering that terraforms planets. Yet basic communication between species remains fraught with errors that would embarrass a first-year linguistics student. The disconnect isn't about intelligence or capability, it's about perspective. Everyone assumes their way of thinking is the default until confronted with evidence to the contrary. Valorium's rarity comes from specific geological conditions that only occur when planetary formation follows precise patterns across millennia. The element requires stellar events, tectonic activity, and atmospheric conditions aligning in ways that might happen once per galaxy per billion years. Its scarcity makes logical sense when you understand the physics involved. Common sense's rarity comes from cultural isolation and fear of the unknown. Species develop internal logic systems that work perfectly within their own context but fail when applied elsewhere. The fear of misunderstanding prevents the very exchanges that could create better understanding. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle, where isolation breeds more isolation. Misunderstanding generates more misunderstanding. Most conflicts arise from preventable misunderstandings rather than irreconcilable differences. The Foundation's case files show pattern after pattern of disputes that began with translation errors, cultural misinterpretations, or simple failure to consider alternative perspectives. The actual substance of the disagreements often could have been resolved easily if the communication channels hadn't been contaminated by basic errors. The Foundation's work proved that practical empathy could be systematically applied. It wasn't about emotional connection or vague goodwill. It was about developing protocols, checklists, and systems that compensated for cognitive differences. The approach treated misunderstanding as an engineering problem rather than a philosophical one, creating practical solutions that actually worked in field conditions. Your partnership demonstrated that different perspectives could create better solutions than any single viewpoint could achieve alone. Your salvage experience provided ground-level practicality, while Crix V's academic background provided theoretical frameworks. Neither approach would have succeeded independently, but combined they addressed problems from multiple angles simultaneously. The solutions emerged from the tension between different ways of thinking, not from one dominating the other. The real treasure wasn't the Valorium. It was the partnership it created. The money provided resources, but the collaboration between human practicality and Cathvolian academic rigor generated the actual value. That combination of perspectives proved more valuable than any material resource because it could address problems that credits alone couldn't solve. It turns out that shared meals are better foundations than corporate treaties. The informal exchange of food created trust that formal agreements couldn't establish. That initial gesture of sharing nutrition paste established a human connection that survived cultural misunderstandings, financial windfalls, and institutional bureaucracy. The Foundation's entire work ultimately traced back to that simple moment of cross-species generosity, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures create the largest impacts. Let me back up to explain what really matters in deep space. It's not the credits in your account or the specs of your spacecraft. It's the systems you build and the connections you maintain. The money eventually got spent on infrastructure, salaries, operational costs, all the unglamorous necessities that keep an organization functioning. The Foundation's work continued long after the Valorium funds were allocated, becoming self-sustaining through service fees and institutional partnerships. The initial windfall provided the launch velocity, but momentum kept it going. Personal wealth provided security, no more worrying about oxygen levels or repair costs, but the systemic impact provided actual meaning. Watching trade agreements succeed because of your translation protocols, seeing cultural exchanges flourish because of your mediation frameworks, that created satisfaction that luxury purchases never approached. The Rust Bucket got retired to a museum display about interspecies cooperation, which felt more appropriate than selling it for scrap. CRIXV's homeworld stabilized through trade relationships the Foundation facilitated. Their economy shifted from desperate resource extraction to cultural exports and specialized services. The Valorium craftsmanship traditions that were nearly lost became valuable again, not as raw materials but as cultural artifacts and historical knowledge. Their refugee population decreased for the first time in generations as opportunities opened both at home and through Foundation programs. Your former salvage colleagues found work in the expanding interspecies economy. The skills that made them good at navigating wreckage made them excellent at navigating cultural misunderstandings. They became field agents, logistics coordinators, practical problem solvers who understood how things actually worked outside theoretical frameworks. The same ingenuity that kept ships flying now kept negotiations moving. Most wealth disappears into personal consumption without lasting impact. You see it across the galaxy. Lottery winners buying luxury orbitals that orbit nothing important. Investors acquiring collections of rare artifacts that sit in storage. Entire fortunes spent on temporary comforts that leave no trace after the credits are gone. The consumption creates momentary pleasure, but no structural change. The decision to share created something that outlasted both of you. The Foundation became an institution with its own momentum, its own staff, its own evolving methodologies. What began as two people trying to resolve an ethical dilemma grew into an organization that employed hundreds across multiple systems. The initial partnership model became standard practice for cross-species initiatives. The initial act of kindness became institutionalized in lasting systems. That meal with CRIXV evolved into standardized protocols for interspecies communication, training programs for diplomatic staff, even educational curricula for young beings learning about galactic cooperation. The personal gesture became professional practice through thousands of small implementations and refinements. The real reward was seeing that first meal create endless others. The Foundation's community kitchens on Nexus 9 served more nutrient paste than you could ever have afforded back when credits were scarce. The cycle continued, beings helping each other across species lines, creating connections that sometimes led to unexpected opportunities. The initial investment kept generating returns in ways that financial instruments never could. Meanwhile, the universe kept twisting in unexpected ways. New species made contact. Old conflicts resurfaced in different forms. Technological changes created fresh communication challenges. The work never really ended. It just evolved into new shapes requiring constant adaptation and creative problem-solving. The Foundation's systems proved flexible enough to handle whatever surprises the galaxy threw their way, which turned out to be the most valuable feature of all. Here's the thing about galactic VIP status. It doesn't usually come from following protocol or checking the right boxes on application forms. Your journey didn't involve battles won or corporate territories conquered. There were no heroic stands against overwhelming odds. No brilliant tactical maneuvers that turned the tide of some interstellar conflict. The entire thing began with sharing food, not seizing power. A simple meal exchange that defied every conventional path to influence in known space. Most hero stories follow familiar patterns. They involve overcoming enemies through strength or cunning, achieving personal glory that gets celebrated in historical records. This story worked differently. It involved recognizing shared humanity, or alienity to be precise, across species lines that usually define separation. The twist wasn't about defeating opposition, but about finding connection where others saw only difference. The narrative arc bent toward understanding rather than conquest. The real twist was that vulnerability created more strength than any weapon could provide. Admitting you were broke, accepting help from an unfamiliar species, acknowledging you didn't have all the answers. These moments of openness created opportunities that defensive posturing would have missed. Weapons create temporary advantages, but understanding creates lasting solutions. The willingness to be wrong, to learn, to adapt proved more powerful than any fleet or army. Your salvage background proved more valuable than military training for the diplomacy that followed. Military training teaches you to achieve objectives through controlled force and disciplined execution. Salvage work teaches you to improvise with limited resources, to identify value where others see wreckage, to make systems work together that weren't designed to cooperate. Those skills translated perfectly to interspecies communication, where protocols often need creative adaptation rather than rigid application. Crixvy's academic knowledge found practical application in real-world conflicts that textbooks never anticipated. His theoretical understanding of cultural frameworks and communication patterns became essential tools for resolving actual disputes. The academic precision that seemed impractical during his hungry days on Nexus Station suddenly became the foundation for solving problems that intuition alone couldn't address. Theory met practice in ways that benefited both. The universe rewarded connection more than conquest in this instance. The systems you built, the relationships you fostered, the understanding you developed. These created value that military victories or corporate acquisitions couldn't match. Conquest creates temporary control that requires constant maintenance. Connection creates organic systems that grow and adapt on their own. The Foundation's work demonstrated that cooperation could achieve what coercion never could. Which brings us to what humanity's real power actually is. It's not in our weapons or our technology or our economic systems. Those are just tools that any sufficiently advanced species can develop. The real power lies in our ability to connect across differences, to find common ground in shared experiences, to recognize that a meal offered in kindness can matter more than a treaty signed under pressure. That practical empathy, that willingness to see ourselves in others regardless of species, that's the asset that other civilizations find both puzzling and invaluable. The galaxy contains countless species with superior technology, longer histories, greater physical capabilities, but that particular combination of practicality and empathy, that ability to bridge theoretical knowledge and real-world application, that appears to be humanity's unique contribution to interstellar relations. Look, I'm going to level with you about cosmic economics. The universe doesn't operate on moral ledgers or karmic balance sheets. Good behavior gets you exactly what bad behavior gets you. Whatever random outcomes the chaos of existence decides to deliver. This story could have ended with theft, betrayal, or simple disappointment. Crixvy might have taken advantage of your offer. The disc could have been worthless. Garrett might have cheated you during the appraisal. The mathematical probability favored negative outcomes across every variable. Most acts of kindness in deep space go unrewarded and unnoticed. They disappear into the vacuum like oxygen leaks, momentary gestures that briefly warm someone's survival struggle before vanishing into the general background misery of station life. For every meal shared that leads to unexpected fortune, thousands get consumed without changing anything except temporary calorie counts. The universe doesn't track these transactions or maintain balance. It just keeps spinning while beings try to survive its indifference. The rarity of Valorium made this particular act visible, not special. The gesture itself was ordinary, one being helping another through shared resources. What made it remarkable was the accidental intersection with an element so rare it defied normal economic models. The kindness wasn't unique, the material it accidentally involved was. The universe provided the spectacular backdrop against which an ordinary human impulse became extraordinary through sheer statistical anomaly. The real miracle was recognizing the opportunity when it appeared. Not the Valorium itself, but the chance to build something from that accidental connection. Many would have taken the money and disappeared, rationalizing it through legal technicalities or simple desperation. Seeing beyond the immediate windfall to the larger possibilities required a particular kind of vision, one that valued potential over possession, future impact over present comfort. Kriksevi's cultural background could have prevented him from accepting help. His species has complex rules about interspecies interaction, debt obligations, and maintaining cultural purity during exile. He might have refused your offer based on protocols designed to preserve Cathvolian identity in foreign environments. The rules exist for legitimate reasons, preventing exploitation, maintaining cultural continuity, but they also create barriers to the very connections that might create change. Your desperation could have prevented you from offering it. When every credit counts toward survival, sharing resources feels like risking vital systems. The station's culture encourages defensive behavior, teaching residents to view others as competitors for limited resources rather than potential collaborators. Your own circumstances nearly dictated selfishness as the only rational choice. The mathematical certainty of self-preservation over the uncertainty of generosity. The reward was in the doing, not the receiving. The meal itself created a connection that the money merely amplified. That moment of shared humanity, or shared beingness across species lines, established a foundation that the financial windfall simply built upon. The Valorium provided means, but the initial gesture provided meaning. The satisfaction came from building something together, not from accumulating resources separately. But here's the final twist about fate and fortune. The universe's randomness doesn't make kindness pointless, it makes it essential, precisely because outcomes aren't guaranteed, because rewards aren't assured. The choice to extend help becomes more significant rather than less. The uncertainty transforms simple gestures into conscious bets against indifference, small acts of defiance against a cosmos that doesn't care whether beings help or harm each other. The lack of cosmic justice doesn't diminish generosity, it elevates it from calculated exchange to meaningful choice. The universe's chaotic twists become navigable when someone chooses to share food instead of guarding credits. That single meal on Nexus 9 rewrote 2 lives because it recognized a shared desperation, one that crossed species, cultures, and economic realities. The real power didn't come from corporate influence or military strength, but from a simple human gesture amplified by circumstance. Sometimes the most galactic impact starts with the most basic acts of connection, reminding us that across the void, what unites beings often matters more than what divides them. The rest was just details.